So, what are some of the activities that we can all engage in this weekend? I've a few things. One, you've got books, and there are so many books that I'm sure all of us would like to read. There's so many books that we have been thinking about reading over time and never really been able to dig into them. Now's a great weekend. You can't go to the gym. You can't go out to restaurants. You can't go visit your crazy Uncle Bill down the street. You know what I mean? You got to just do what you got to do at home. Be with family. A lot of family time for people, which is interesting. I'm kidding about this. Most people, I'm sure, cherish all the family time. But for those who are in a house with like 3 or 4 young kids, I'm sure it's a bit lively in there right now with the kids not in school and staying home all day. That's got to be its own challenge. I have a little furry friend here, as in a French bulldog, that is staying with me, and she is a handful, let me tell you. And that's not even a human being that I'm responsible for, but she's still a little bit of a handful. So books that I have out here, I mentioned, it's funny, I'm actually just looking now. I will just tell you about the books that I'm physically actually surrounded with right now. And all of the ones that I will call out to you are, well, these are ones that I've read that I think you will really, really enjoy. There's a whole bunch of different versions of Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War. I mentioned that yesterday. The landmark Thucydides is the one that I have. Highly recommend. If you like military strategy and war and things like that, this is a must. You have to read this book at some point. So it's dense, and it's long, it's big, but I think you will like it. The Power Broker, History of Robert Moses by the very revered biographer Robert Caro. The Power Broker is like a 900 some odd pages, a big book. It's very good though. It's about how a bureaucrat like Robert Moses wielded so much power and really created his own kingdom instead of bureaucracy. I'm looking at more books now. I've got Orwell's Animal Farm out. Now, this is for everybody. If you have not read Animal Farm, if you haven't read it, I think that this weekend you should almost consider that your homework. I would read Animal Farm this weekend if I were you. If you haven't read it before, you'll read it in a day, maybe a day and a half. You'll rip right through it. And if you're listening to this and you're high school or college age, I know we got Team Buck Campus. You guys are all home, and gals are all home now. You'll really enjoy it. But even if you think of yourself as a grizzled veteran of the intellectual battles with socialism and communism, and you've read lots of Hayek and von Mises and you name it, you don't know about the Austrian school. You could take people to the Austrian school. If you really are into that stuff, it's still worth, if you haven't read Animal Farm in a long time, going back and reading it. It is truly brilliant. And the specificity and the way that Orwell really mirrored much of the rise of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and the rhetoric and the tricks and the tools and the oppression. And it's incredible. I've also got a book over here on Hannibal. Hannibal, the general from Carthage who almost managed to stamp out the Roman Empire. I mean, almost managed to just defeat entirely the Roman Empire. And some of the battles, like, there's so many ways of saying this, and some of you are going to say that's not how you say it. I've read books just on the battle, and people will say cannae, canny, and can I. You will hear all three depending on which version of the Latin you go with. People will say cannae, cannae, can I, Cannae. But one of the most catastrophic battles in ancient warfare that any force ever faced, and the Romans lost and were an entire army annihilated, tens of thousands of people annihilated with sharp objects and clubs, not annihilated with machine guns. I mean, think about what that would have been like. Fascinating. Hannibal crossing the Alps with the elephants. One of the great military campaigns of all human history, certainly up there with Cortez and the conquest of Mexico, the Aztecs. It's really an incredible story. So I highly recommend you pick up a book if you haven't already. If you want a classic version of it, If you want a classic version, I would say you could go with Livy did The War with Hannibal. Livy, an ancient Roman historian. So he's kind of he's the Thucydides of the Punic War, which is the wars between Rome and Carthage. Steve Cole, The Bin Ladens. It is a really well-written book. Steve Cole's a very talented author. He's a liberal, but he's a very talented author. I don't think anyone really cares that much about bin Laden anymore. So that's a book that I read back when Al-Qaeda was the single biggest threat that we faced. Now things obviously feel very different. So I don't know if I could give you that one as a top recommendation for right now. William Manchester, A World Lit Only by Fire. I think that's a fantastic kind of narrative overview history of the medieval period. If you haven't read it, William Manchester is also one of the great biographers. And the two biographies that he wrote that I could highly recommend you, I've read both of them. American Caesar with Douglas MacArthur, which is maybe a bit hagiographic. I mean, he makes the case. Douglas MacArthur, you read that biography, you're like, this guy was amazing. Nimitz does not get nearly, I'm just telling you what the takeaway is. Nimitz does not get the same love for his strategic skill as MacArthur gets, that's for sure. But you have that, and also William Manchester, who is the professor emeritus of history at Wesleyan University, which is one of the most liberal places on the planet, I think. But he is certainly not Manchester wasn't a big lib. I believe he passed away some years ago. But he wrote a biography, a 2-series biography of Churchill. The first one is the best known, The Last Lion. I've read that one. It's excellent. The second one is Alone. That's really Churchill's period in the political wilderness. And there's a movie that you can watch that goes along with that period of Churchillian history called The Gathering Storm. If you liked that Gary Oldman Churchill movie that came out a few years ago, Darkest Hour, or was it Finest Hour? No, Darkest Hour, not Finest Hour, whatever. If you like that Gary Oldman movie, the Churchill Gathering Storm movie, it's not, there's no action. It's almost like a stage play that you're watching. But the guy who plays Churchill in The Gathering Storm is the best Churchill. It's the best Churchillian actor I've ever seen in my life. So it's worth it just for that aspect alone. You're really just watching a guy embody Winston Churchill and walk around and be like, pigs look you in the eye. There's a whole. So I could recommend, and I'm sure you can get that on Amazon Prime, any number of places. I'm trying to see what else we have here. I have a book called The Society of the Muslim Brotherhood, of the Muslim Brothers. If you want to learn the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, you could read that one, but it's dense. It's not a fun read. I cannot tell you that that's one that you're going to be like, oh, Buck, this is great. I'm just telling you what books I happen to have surrounded myself with now because I had to shift stuff around my tiny New York apartment. Let's see here. The Devils Horseman. A quick read, an interesting read. This specifically focuses on, and I think some of the books that I have, like the Society of the Muslim Brothers, I think if you go on Amazon and try to get it, they want usually like $40 or $50 for it. It's kind of rare. Some of these are out of print because you know how I do. Go over to the Strand bookstore, not the rare book section, but the history book section, and pick up books that are out of print because that's how the Buckster parties on Saturday afternoon when the city's not on lockdown. So speaking of the Buckster parties, now I've literally got a French bulldog that heard someone in the hallway. Tallulah, come back here. She's being naughty. She's being naughty because she thinks she can get away with it because, it's the end of the world as we know it, and nobody feels fine. Just kidding. We're all going to be fine. Tallulah, stop that. So we also have, let's see here. A book on Piers Paul Reed, a book on the Templars. This guy is not really a classic historian, but he does a really excellent job in this book on the Templars. I think he also wrote about that. I think he wrote the book that was turned into the movie Alive about the soccer team that went down over the Andes and ended up eating people so that, eating some of their own dead so they could escape and not die because they were freezing to death and had no provisions up in the Andes Mountains. So I'm telling you that the Templars, that the book that he wrote, Piers Paul Reed, it's very readable, you move through it really quickly. It's excellent overview of the subject matter. So that's a really good one. I'm trying to think of what else would be in the, Orwell, all art is propaganda. I got a lot of Orwell around me right now, but I don't want to overdo that. Pity the Nation by Robert Fisk. Robert Fisk has kind of gone off into some crazy directions in recent years, from what I understand. But his overview history of the conflict in Lebanon and Syria, what we think of as the Lebanese civil war. If you care about that, it's very interesting. But that's not on the. I'm just telling you what's around me right now. That's not on the recommended list. Ooh, John Keegan, Intelligence in War, and also Martin Anderson, Reagan's Secret War. Very good books. Highly recommend you check these out. I think you'll really enjoy them. Understanding that intelligence can be such a game changer in warfare. It's just a fascinating topic. And if you like that movie about the Enigma machine, The Imitation Game, if you like that, you'll love these books. I mean, they talk about different things from intelligence and war, obviously, as the title indicates. So highly, highly recommend you check those out.